Thank you, Andrew, for those kind words, also those very moving words. Please do keep safe, and please keep, if you're living in dangerous zones, please keep Andrew updated. Otherwise, he gets anxious and very concerned about you, and rightfully so. It's a real honor to introduce Professor Abdullahi al-Naim. I know that he doesn't need an introduction, but nevertheless, we need to honor him and thank him for doing this very important memorial lecture for us. Professor al-Naim has taught, has been a lawyer and has taught in Sudan, in Canada, in the United States. He's carried out research in Norway in the early years. In the US, he's taught at UCLA, he's taught at Harvard, and he's been in Emory since 1995. So very well established academic. But also, when I started doing research in the mid-1990s, you know, if you were looking at Islam and women's rights, Islam and religious minorities, the question of respect for human rights and how to advocate for reform and for really the strategies and advocacy that one might use, the methodology one might use to advance human rights standards and thinking in a particular community, and the community, of course, and the framework that he was engaging with was that of Islam. So his work is certainly controversial. He has, I can say really there's a literature that has built, and many doctoral students have defended different projects on the back of that groundbreaking research. They don't always agree with him, but what is wonderful about his scholarship is that it is always Professor al-Naim. You don't confuse it with other voices, and you certainly won't forget it. He has researched on many different areas. One of the early pieces that I read was about torture and the prohibition of torture in Islam. He's written on women and religion in Africa. He's written about that very, how to internal transformation and religious responses to human rights, how to advocate for it, and as well as the scholarship and all the literature that that has inspired and generated. Also, there are many advocacy groups around the world, from international networks to networks in Malaysia and Africa, and you can also track a lot of that as responses built around some of that groundbreaking research he has done. Also, there is the research that he has done on the future of the Sharia and the secular state that I'm sure you followed, and today's lecture is in relation to a forthcoming book about decolonizing human rights. So there's also been a journey, not only of himself from Sudan to various countries and various universities, and that can be tracked in the scholarship, but also there's been this journey of the different subjects that have occupied him. And what I really love about his work is that he's not hidden in the research that he produces. So it's also a human response and a personal take on these subjects that occupy many of us in different ways in our work. So thank you, Professor al-Naim, and we can't wait.
Thank you. I suggested this title to Andrew when I was asked about giving this lecture. I called it an urgent plea for rebuttal. Because I think that's why I'm saying it's extremely extraordinary for me to be able to address you on this, because I mean, this is one of the most appropriate audiences for rebutting what I am about to say, or confirming, of course, I hope, but in any case, it is here that's where I can get a real feel for where I'm heading with this. Somewhat half-jokingly, I said it the other day, I think in class, but I will say it now. I'm not trying to persuade any of us out of a job. And the jobs that we do are not just simply careers that we do. They are really something that we do with passion and conviction. And it's because of that, I think I am hoping to initiate a conversation that will enable us to do what we do better, and sometimes I think almost do it all over again in a different way. Because I think that there is something that you will agree with me soon, I hope, that is profoundly problematic about the way that what we do is conceived and is practiced and presented around the world. I start with a personal narrative that is not real. I think already you heard some of it, but the point I'm making here is that in the part in my notes I called personal narrative, is that I started in the 1970s as a law student in Sudan, basically with the personal conflict and tension between being a Muslim and being a human rights advocate. I did not want to give up on either of them, but I did not have to reconcile the two. Because my understanding of Islam was Sharia, and my understanding of human rights was the Universal Declaration and its aftermath. Over time, I came to, I was fortunate enough to encounter a methodology and a way of thinking and a lifestyle that enabled me to reconcile Islam, or my understanding of Sharia and Islam, with my conviction in human rights. So for some time in the 80s, I continued to write in terms of how to reconcile Sharia with human rights. But I had taken at that point human rights for granted. I did not question the concept of the paradigm or the institutions and norms and process. But in the 90s, I came to question that too. So that's how I became a double heretic. I'm both a heretic of traditional understandings of Islam and what I would call traditional understandings of human rights too. Or rather relativist, which is of course the human rights advocate is, what do you mean? How can we be relativists? So I remain adherent to the faith in human rights, but I think that for that to be true, in fact, every time I say that term, I wonder about whether we really understand and appreciate what it means, and whether the way in which we use it is really honestly, intellectually honest about what it's about. Part of my conversation is what I call the dialectic of ends and means. That the commitment is to the human dignity of every single human being by virtue of their humanity. And often we tend to mention that as if it is our definition of human rights. But I think we need to say more than that. This is probably what human rights are intended to achieve, but whether or not our understanding is truly honest and consistent with that claim is what I would like to present to you for discussion this afternoon. I think that the reality is that the vision of universality of human rights is fundamentally challenging to all societies and to all human beings. Every single one of us in this room is challenged by the true dimension and true nature of the claim of universality of human rights. Because if they are the universal, then they are the universal in the sense of that every human being, by virtue of being human. And we cannot have the subject of human rights being told what their human rights are. So it follows immediately in my mind that human beings who are the subject of human rights must be the authors of what those rights are, and must be the primary actors in realizing those rights. So to the extent that what we have been doing so far is marginalize major sections of humanity from the exercise and the process of defining what human rights are and of realizing them, the very pretense that we can defend other people's human rights is really an affront to the claim of universality. Because it has to be the person herself or himself who would articulate what they see to be their rights and also how to go about protecting them. So these sort of questions led me to raise something that you may have come across in my writings about what I call the double paradox of universality and to state-centric legal protection. The first part is to say how can we have universal standards of human rights in the reality of extreme and permanent and profound diversity. That if we want to somehow suppress the force and the power of that diversity in sort of in the hope of achieving uniformity of understanding of what universality is, then we are doing a disservice, as I was saying, to the claim of universality. But it is a challenge, it is a paradox, how to realize a shared understanding of what human rights are in the reality of the fundamental difference that we share also, which in itself, by the way, a human rights principle and dimension. I think Albie Sachs is the one who said human rights are about the right to be different. So being different is fundamental to what human rights are about. But the paradox of self-regulation by the state, of course, is the one that I tend to, at least in these remarks, will be highlighting, is that it is really somewhat strange that we entrust the state, which is the primary, if not only the only violator of human rights. So we create these norms, which are obligations of states, that only states can honor, but only state can assume. And what about the subject in all of this? I mean, so if the human being is the subject of human rights, how can I entrust my rights to be defined by states, implemented and protected by states against states? That is the nature, I think, briefly, of the paradox here. There has been, of course, a process of arguing about the origins of human rights, the foundations of human rights, and is it human dignity? Is it being created in the image of God? Is it sort of all sort of, and of course the fact that the first article of the Universal Declaration avoided any reference to the source, but people kept insisting about finding a source, the source. And of course, I mean, one way of trying to come out of this corner that we paint ourselves in is that there is no single source. There is multiple sources, multiple foundations. And let each one of us have their own. The question is not whether or not your foundation agrees with my foundation, but it's whether or not we are committed to the same values and the same norms. So it is in a way that the process of trying to build consensus around the Universal Declaration from 1948 onwards has been the project of trying to legitimize and root universality of human rights in different cultures, which is something that I personally subscribe to and try to contribute to. But in time, I came to really to question what I call now the relativity of the Universal Declaration. And here comes the heresy, is that the Universal Declaration is not universal and cannot possibly be universal. It is a liberal view of what the universality of human rights might mean. But in itself, it is not universal of all humanity and all perspectives of different cultures and traditions and religious doctrine and so on. So in other words, if we are truly to listen to every person, globally speaking, and to see what their view of human rights would be, many of them may agree with the Universal Declaration, but many would not. Probably, I think the majority would not. In any case, that process never happened. That people were never consulted about what they think of the universality of human rights. It has been assumed that whenever we say human rights, what we mean is the Universal Declaration and its aftermath, the declarations, the treaties, and so on. So entrusting in treaties among states or between states as the means to enforce what was assumed to be universal is really the double sort of problem that I see. Because, and I would very much, as I said, I'm seeking rebuttal here. How can the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be universal when it is representative of particular view of that universality? Now, in other words, the charge that had always been there in the conversation, in the discourse, in the scholarship, is that there is universality of human rights embedded in the Universal Declaration, and there is cultural relativism. So anybody who disagrees with any aspect of the Universal Declaration is a cultural relativist, reduced to sort of being apologetic about what they are trying to disagree about. And what I'm trying to raise this afternoon and hopefully go forward with it is to totally reverse this claim. To say that those who insist on the universality of human rights in the Universal Declaration are the relativists. That there is, in fact, no given universality, no universality that we can discover or proclaim. That universality is a process. It is a product of a human struggle, each from their own perspective, experiences, context, and not necessarily seeking a shared understanding. It is in fact just simply seeking what we believe to be our due for being human as we understand it on our own terms. So if there is going to be some consensus, it should emerge as a result of that process, but should not be the objective of that process. Because the push and the pressure to come to consensus itself distorts the process and the struggle. So in this way, I'm saying that I'm deliberately and very, very heads-on challenging the claim that the Universal Declaration is universal. And often when I say this, I'm asked, what do you miss in the Universal Declaration? What is not there? One answer which I have given often is that I don't know. And it is not only to me to decide what is missing. The point is that all the voices that should have had a say in what is missing are the ones who are missing. We don't know what other peoples might have presented as their priorities or their concerns. Even the concept of rights itself, when we say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that notion of rights is a liberal notion of rights. It's supposed to be justiciable, it's supposed to be specific obligations that the state owes to people. It has to be negative or so-called passive rights, not affirmative. All of that is liberal talk, which is fine for liberals, but it doesn't really bring together all the worries and concerns and frustration that human beings have around the world. I'm often, when I try to clarify this point, I'm reminded of massive, massive cities in the global south, as we call it. Think of Karachi, think of Lagos, think of Cairo. And think of going around those streets and asking people on those streets what human rights means to them. What sort of concerns, if they are to be told, these are the rights that you are entitled to by virtue of your humanity. These are something that will be sacrosanct, that every state will be, and every not state, and that, by the way, is also a problem. The expectation that the state will be the one who will provide protection for these rights. I think we will not be surprised that we will come with very, very different answers. So, my point to the question about what is missing is that what is missing is the fact that that question was raised so that people can know what is and what is not missing. What is missing is that the voices that can say what is missing have been missing. The experiences that should have counted in deciding what is missing have not been taken seriously. And I think if we do, actually, if we just hypothetically, absolutely, I would not expect any of the rights in the Universal Declaration to be the first 10 priorities of people around the world. I think a livelihood, health care, housing, these claims, entitlements, which liberals or the liberal mind refuses to acknowledge as rights, are in fact the fundamental basis of what human dignity is about. And what I would expect, if I was asked, and if my voice was free, then I would say these are my priorities. And it's really remarkable that we tend to think of, we take freedom of expression as a fundamental right, but the right to education is not. What does it mean to have a right to freedom of expression if you do not have a right to education? You are not aware of what is there to be challenged or to be talked about or contested, because you are never given a chance to discover within yourself the values of knowledge, of insight, of understanding history, and so on. So it is from this perspective I would like to present to you and really to call for a rebuttal my claim that the Universal Declaration is not universal. It can be part of a conversation, of a struggle to come to some universal understanding, but it should not by itself, by virtue of being the Universal Declaration. And then I come to the point about how whatever it is that the Universal Declaration may have been envisaged, have been hijacked by states and by governments, and that it has become so dependent on states and governments that it lost all credibility as an independent, autonomous source of challenge to what governments do. And I think most of, if not all of us in this room are international lawyers, and we know the limitations of international law, which are structural. The fact that international law being what it is, relying on states and treaties to define human rights, where states have the right, for one thing, they are the ones who negotiate these treaties. None of us is present in the diplomatic sort of conferences and meetings where state representatives are the ones who have the voice to decide and to choose what language to define a right with and what right to identify in the first place. That then treaties are drafted for states to choose to ratify or not to ratify. And when they ratify, they choose to enter all sorts of reservations, understandings, and so on. And the ultimate, I think, paradox in this, or strange factor, is that I call human rights treaties orphans. The law of treaties is premised on the fact that the authors of treaties, the state parties to treaties, are the ones who are most interested in pursuing the implementation and practice of those treaties, except human rights treaties. So we have used a structure of international human rights treaty making with its premise and assumptions about the agency and motivation of states to enforce the treaties to apply it to a field where states have absolutely the opposite interest and concern. And of course we know about the Genocide Convention Treaty and how it was the ICJ at the very beginning giving that advisory opinion spoke about the humanitarian nature of human rights treaties and why they should be upheld and so on. But the problem is that there is no mechanism by which this is to be realized. So at the end of the day, still it is the states who decide. And still it is states who are unlikely to decide and have historically shown themselves unwilling to decide. And maybe more of this will be said, I hope, maybe in my remarks or in the discussion. So what I'm saying is that also the logic of remedy as protection, which I find it's a liberal notion, and it is extremely inadequate as a way. Protection, for me, English is not my native language, but protection is to preempt and prevent the harm from happening in the first place. Not to chase harm after it has been done in order to provide a so-called remedy, which is very rarely realized for the so-called victim. So in other words, what we think of as protection of human rights is a global strategy of NGOs, of international institutions, which are designed and intended to wait until a violation happens. But we do not have proactive power and authority to prevent violations from happening in the first place. And of course, we cannot afford to overlook capitalism as a structural foundational source of human rights violations. In the vast majority of societies around the world, hunger, disease, lack of education, lack of health resources, and all of that, fundamental human insecurity is driven by economic forces over which even states have little control. So the states of the, like if you take of 194 or so, globally, the states that are capable of really protecting their sovereignty and the territorial integrity of their population and their land and their resources are really a tiny minority. Most states are not capable of defending their own sovereignty. And yet sovereignty is supposed to be the basis for their obligation and claims of protection of human rights. So many, I think, points to be, I think the question of justiciability, why should that be a criteria? Because the assumption is that it has to be a right that I can take to a court that will enforce. That assumes that the rest of the universe of that place is organized and working well, and that the violation is the exception rather than the rule, and that there is in fact institutions and there are in fact resources that I can use to enforce the right in that justiciability sense. But we know, of course, that is not the case in vast majority of states around the world. There is fundamentally, absolutely very little, if any, judicial structure or infrastructure, resources, time, money to be able to do this. That I wait until my violation, my right of violation has occurred, that I am in a position, this single person sitting somewhere in Darfur or sitting somewhere in Kigali or any other place that you like, who is capable of taking up the issue, investigating, prosecuting, or seeking remedy and getting the remedies 3-5 years down the road, and then what? The assumption that deterrence is a strategy for human rights protection, that people will worry about the fact that if someone is held accountable and this and that, then maybe I shouldn't do it, is again, it's very naive. It is not a worldly wise premise and assumption. In most places, people have no fear whatsoever of what the state and the police and the institutions of judiciary and so on can do. Because they know that whatever it is, that especially the most powerful are the ones who can get away with anything, including murder, literally. So there are many problems. The fact that it is piecemeal, it is reactive, that it is slow, it's expensive, and all of these impediments to the protection of human rights in that way. Now, you may wonder then, what am I going to do? I mean, what am I leading to? I'm leading to the tried and true, throughout human history, means by which change is achieved and sustained, which is political mobilization and cultural transformation. In any society where change has been achieved and where that possibility has been sustained, it has been through cultural transformation that is changing people's attitudes about the issue, and political mobilization, that whatever that people have come to as a result of their transformed understanding of their community and their culture and values and so on, that they should have the political will to implement and to defend. In fact, these two pillars are the only pillars by which any level of state protection can happen. States are not going to be moved to act against any type of abuse, child abuse or trafficking in human beings or whatever that you can think of, without political mobilization and cultural transformation. Unless there is a critical change, a critical mass who are committed to these values, the state is not going to be moved. And the state, by the way, is not an autonomous actor, as we know. The state is just simply a vessel. It's a tool. Of course, the Marxists said it. I mean, it is the executive committee of the ruling class, but it is definitely that. It is just a vessel through which whoever had the political resources and the material resources can use the institutions of the state to implement their political will. But not that it has an autonomous, independent, humane, visionary will to protect the rights of human beings. So So in a way, I think that our assumptions about the current practice of protection of human rights is really colonized by what I call liberal relativism. That the idea of what rights mean, how they can be implemented or defined, and so on, all of that is the reason I chose the term decolonizing human rights, because it is an actual colonization. It is, you know, we tend to think of colonial and colonization as physical. That the way that, of course, I mean, in fact, you might wonder, sometimes some colleagues will say, I shouldn't be talking about European colonialism, I should be talking about European imperialism. It is imperialism, but it is colonial imperialism, which is different than just simply imperialism. Colonization is displacement. And the way that Europeans have done it around the world is to physically displace and exterminate the pre-existing population, to replace them by European populations. But displacement can happen in other ways. When you displace the consciousness, when you displace the identity, when you displace the priorities of a people, you have displaced them, all but physically. And physically really is not that much when everything else has been displaced. So in other words, physical displacement, which was sort of the obvious and classic, you might say, tool of colonialism, is now, and what is significant actually about European colonialism, more than most other types of imperialism in history, is that its ability to displace. There is someone, a Nigerian scholar actually, I mentioned in class the other day, and I was excited that one of the students knew him and his work, Malik bin Nabi, who used to say that he used to write about coloniality. The tendency and the ability of people to accept being colonized is a quality, it reflects, he used to say that colonialism is a consequence, not a cause. But I think beyond that, it is a consequence that creates or perpetuates that cause. What European colonialism has done, and I hope that will be relevant to what we are saying here, is that it had perfected the ability to perpetuate itself in the subject of colonialism. So that we keep replicating the European epistemology, European models of thinking, the European production relations and everything, assuming that to be, and the way it happens was to say, well, this is the way of the civilized. If you want modernity, if you want sort of to be counted among really civilized nations, this is what you have to do. So if you do it, then you are a poor copy of the European origin or original. And if you don't, then what do you expect from a primitive society which is uncivilized in the first place? And I know it will shock some of us, but I have a very strong feeling that what we now talk human rights discourse is a variety of the civilizing mission of the white man. It's a way of defining what is to be human, what is to be civilized, what is to be superior, and that if you accept, then okay, so toe the line and we will take you there. Struggling and kicking maybe, but it's still you are in the right side of issues. But if you don't, then sorry, what do you expect? I mean, you are this and that in the final analysis and so on. So these are the sorts of that I have in terms of critique and so on. There is another feature about the nature of international human rights law, we call it that. I have to keep calling it because unless I use a very cumbersome phrase of saying what is presented or pretended to be universal rights and so on. It is not. These are not. The universal declaration is not. But I cannot keep saying that. I hope that the point is made once and that we realize maybe that that fault should really restrain our claims about what this subject is and what the rights are. But the point is that I'm saying that the nature of it is that it is a way of sort of this is also one of the critical, I think, points I should have started with earlier on, is the question of these are the rights of the human. They are not the rights of the citizen. And one of the fundamental sort of qualities and features of current international human rights law, so-called, is that it is entirely translated into rights of citizens before it can be applied and implemented anywhere. In no state whatsoever, anywhere, is international human rights law applied as such. It is applied after and through the process of translation into civil rights. And the reason that is obvious, I mean, around this continent, in this particular time, if human rights are the rights of the human, then there will be the entitlement of refugees. There will be the entitlement of migrant workers, because those are human beings. They don't lose the quality of being human for being refugees or for being migrant workers. Since nowhere do we afford the same protection of rights of refugees as human rights, in the same way that take the Universal Declaration and go down that list and see how much of those rights are secured and granted to refugees. In the United States, where I live, the phenomenon of indefinite detention, awaiting determination of whether or not you qualify to be admitted or not to be admitted as a refugee, no American citizen will be subjected to that. And constantly in the media, in popular discourse, in law review articles, constantly the talk is he a human right, is he a civil American citizen? So why should American citizen be relevant if we're talking about the rights of the human? So the point, therefore, I think in the nature of international human rights law is that it has to be translated into domestic civil rights law in order to be implemented through institutions of the state domestically, and at that level, the non-citizen will not receive the protection of human rights that we proclaim in the international treaties. I think that I hope that I have been saying enough to make the point, but let me finish here by there is this often talk about, I mean, like when someone says what I'm saying now is, are you saying that the international community should sit back and wait and watch this happening or that being done and so on? So as if there's something called the international community, which has an address, which is an entity that I can call up or maybe fax or email and say, come on, international community, come and save me. That is an utter sort of fallacy. The international community is a metaphor for neo-colonial powers. Think about any event and any instance in which any sort of galvanization or mobilization of so-called international community was made. And who initiated that? Who drove it? Who had the power to name it? And of course, the claim that how can the international community sit back and watch seems to imply that the international community is in fact not going to sit back and watch, although it sits back and watches all the time. You know, again, this fallacy that there is some so-called international community which, if it hasn't been for my relativism, would have been moved to act. In fact, it doesn't act. In the most sort of horrendous and glaring examples of 300,000 people killed in Darfur, what did the international community do for them? 5 million people killed in Congo. What did the international community do for them? And so on. There are many, many examples from any part of the world. The international community is where the strategic interests of the major powers lie. And that's what motivates their action. And by the way, their action is utterly arbitrary because they decide when to act or not to act, and what sort of action to take, how long it should last, what objectives it should seek. So I don't like to mention that term, the so-called humanitarian intervention, because it is an intervention but has nothing to do with humanitarian. it has been the tool of colonialism since the 17th century. The claim or the pretense that we are here to save you from yourself or to save you from your own primitive ways. But still it goes on. Look around the world and see. I mean, in this country, I don't need to mention examples, but to see how and when the so-called international community moves. And again, what sort of, there is no transparency about the reasons why they moved. There is no accountability for those reasons or for the actions they take. And they can do whatever they please, stay however long they choose, and leave when they want to. There is no sort of an understanding of what the objectives are which justify their intervention in the first place, and how much of those objectives have been realized. Think of some instances of that. Think of instances like, for example, Vietnam. Let's go back a little bit away from the current tragedies. Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia. How can we talk about the international community when an intervention is supposed to save a people from horrendous Pol Pot crimes of hundreds of thousands of people being killed, and yet that regime denied the seat of Cambodia at the United Nations for almost a decade, I think, if I remember correctly. So it has to be an intervention by one of the neo-colonial Western powers for it to be accepted as such, and that we block it from any recognition or respect because we don't like the intervener and what we think they are likely to do and what risk they bring to our interests and so on. And in any case, coercive intervention is unlikely to have any lasting impact in terms of economic and social conditions or democratic transformation of any society. I call it the flash flood. You know, the phenomenon of flash flood is comes through the house or a room and just washes everything away, leaves nothing behind. And so like 5-10 minutes later, you have an empty room with nothing to show for what came by and through the place. Because military forces, when they intervene, they're not going to intervene in an intelligent, sustained way that is capable of gaining trust of local communities. Militaries are trained to kill and are trained to distrust, and they are created to destabilize. That's what they're trained for. That's what they are paid for. We would never use military forces in our own streets in the so-called developing world, or developed world of the North or global North. Never is it conceivable. It becomes an utter constitutional crisis to talk about even about introducing civil, military personnel on the streets of any city. It took Katrina for something like that, and again, we know how it goes. But so how can it that we think it so easily and appropriate just simply to send the troops and expect them to do humanitarian work without any supervision, without any possibility of accountability and so on. Now there is something that which I cannot possibly afford to overlook, which is the invasion of Iraq. Now, the danger about our talk about universal human rights and the protection of human rights by international institutions and so on is that it is sort of a lullaby. Not alibi, lullaby, I think I am using the word right. Meaning it is something that we send children to sleep with. Don't worry, we have you covered. Your rights are protected. We have international treaties, we have humanitarian law, we have sort of the Human Rights Council, and everybody is looking after it. But then people lower their guard and they forget to struggle, and they forgot to be vigilant. And then you come to something like the invasion of Iraq. A horrendous crime against humanity of the first magnitude. Really fundamentally flawed. And I say this deliberately and clearly, and I've said it in writing and everything. Stupid, reckless, unaccountable, and totally counterproductive. You come in and you destroy a state to create a vacuum that breeds ISIS. And then you don't know what to do with ISIS. And you do not know what to do with ISIS. And you will keep not knowing what to do with ISIS. Because ISIS is not the fighters who may have been killed in Mosul or may be chased out of Iraq and Syria. ISIS is a powerful idea that comes out of fundamental anger and frustration. I was very much moved by Andrew's expression of anger, and that human rights, I think the expression that was very moving, the colleague who said a human rights lawyer is an international lawyer who got angry. Yes, but let each and every one of us get angry about every time any human rights violation occurs anywhere in the world. Let each and every one of us refuse to accept the possibility that international criminals like George W. Bush and Tony Blair should escape accountability for crimes against humanity of that magnitude. What level of accountability has either of them faced? So therefore, I mean, when we really tell people that, oh, trust us, human rights law will protect you, humanitarian law will protect you, and we fail to deliver. Now, I think that I'm sure that examples can be found to the contrary, as well as that my examples are also going to be partial. But the point is that the nature of the structures and the institutions by which we work limits our possibility. I mean, even if any of us and all of us are angry enough to want to do everything that we can, it is very little that we can do. There is something what I call human rights dependency also, which is part of this conversation. That the assumption is that if we send delegates from our international organizations, we choose where to send them, what to investigate. They collect information based on the work of local organizations. They come back and write the reports in London and New York to release the reports timed to a hook, so-called, of events like a World Bank meeting or a G7 or G8 or G20, whatever you call them, happened to be at the time. So now the whole process is premised on that if we monitor and document objectively and truthfully, if we engage in very highly developed human rights, what I call human rights journalists, we call them human rights organizations, but with all due respect, they do one part of the job of trying to document and collect the information and present it. To whom? Not to the populations who are the victims of those violations. But they present them to so-called donor governments, which can choose whether or not to act on them. And when they do act, they are very selective about against whom they act. This is what I call human rights dependency. It's a dependency that is structural. Because the only thing that international human rights organizations or national can do is to gather information and present it and engage in advocacy. What's advocacy? That you try to, again, access to a minister or a press secretary to present the case as you see it. And that's it. What else can you do? Please correct me if I am wrong. What can international human rights organizations or any other human rights sort of actor do more than that? So, now, therefore, I would like to go back to what I was saying, that I think my beef, you might say, I think it's an expression that one can say, is that we encourage communities to lower their guard. We encourage communities to believe that we are there to protect them and we are capable of protecting them. We encourage and push people even to in fact, to give up on strategies of struggle. Demonstrations, strikes, types of things that have always been the tool of change. And we say, no, please don't do that. That is disruptive. You will create a negative image of your cause. Be polite and patient and help will come and so on. So I'm investing in what I call agents of social change. People who are local actors, who live the life of their communities, who have the cultural fluency and linguistic access, who can actually make the transformation that people need to have in their lives. And at the end of the day, I'm not really letting any of us off the hook in any way. Whatever you think ought to be our human rights, that should be protected, by all means, do so. But do it in a way that makes it possible and sustainable. Change the attitudes of the communities in question about the right in question. So those who are struggling for the rights of women and equality, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, whatever it is, absolutely, just make it the commitment and the values of the community, so that in their exercise of their democratic rights, they will uphold those values. But if you expect that it will come from international protests and sort of CNN reports, then I think you will be disappointed. I should maybe stop so that we can take some questions. I think, what else did I not say? Yeah, I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
So I think there were many issues there. I can see hands already. Where will domestic change come from? Where will respect for human rights come from? And have we been misguided and fooling the citizenry about this? Sorry, the human beings, not just citizens.
Yes.
Good evening. Thank you so much. I should have realized that when I spoke with you earlier on, and I wanted to take a picture with you because of the sheet.
Ah.
And I didn't have a good excuse in case you asked me why do you want to take a picture. But now I realize you were esteemed speaker, so it's a good excuse. Well, I have two questions for you. I was wondering if you see a conflict between rights, as you say in empowerment, that essentially seek to emphasize the equalizing of rights amongst all individuals, regardless of nationality, in a democratizing way, and the conflict with the source you identified as being capitalist, that essentially should be exclusive, should seek to actually be taking away rights from others, and should be seeking something more exclusive in order to impose more control and such. You see a conflict between the two. And then the other thing is where you seek to redefine what rights are. What would you see as an alternative as fundamental human rights as it's currently identified, as it's currently defined? What would you see as an alternative?
Okay. I am the alternative. You are the alternative. Every person from any part of the world is the alternative. I started by saying that if I talk about the fundamental human rights and dignity of the person, it must be the person who decides what those rights are. That may not yield a neat list of universally accepted standards or norms, but that is not the point. The point is that people articulate for themselves what their priorities are. And if our claim that what we have now in these universal treaties and documents are in fact universal rights, it will be very easy to persuade people to accept them. It shouldn't be difficult now, 70 years later, we are celebrating 70 years of the Universal Declaration. It shouldn't be difficult for people to accept any and all of those rights as fundamental universal human rights. But the effort has not been made because the people are not taken seriously enough to be persuaded. We do not invest in their agency, that they decide what the rights are. And we don't want to risk their dissent in saying, no, actually I don't think freedom of religion is this, or freedom of expression is that. I would rather have housing and healthcare and personal security. Who wouldn't? The people who put the list of the so-called negative liberal rights already have those securities of healthcare and education and this and that, but the people who lack them are the ones who are entitled to say what their priorities are. So I'm saying that it should be the process, to begin with, limiting it to rights is problematic. Because some people might claim it as entitlements. I sense that you are an African, as I am. And in our traditional communities and societies, the notion of rights is not the primary notion. It's a notion of relationships, of mutual obligations and duties, as well as rights, claims in the sense of entitlements. It is not a question of justiciability, that you don't have to have a right to go to court to be able to exercise the right. One of the fundamental gaps in the Universal Declaration that I see is a total lack of regard for elderly people. We don't know, because it doesn't fit the model. The idea that these people should have entitlement to being treated with humanity and dignity in their old age, to be secured the fundamental services they need, and to do so in their communities and families, not in institutions. The liberal mind is incapable of imagining that. And of course, therefore, I don't want to get out of already what I have of tremendous value. I am old now by the way. I'm 71, so I'm close to that. So I need to be treated with human dignity when I'm no longer capable of being able to sustain myself or to live sort of able to gain access to this and that and the other. There is absolutely no place, help me understand, in the entire human rights corpus for responding to that need. Who or which human being who would not be in need of that? What society or community that would not be in need of that? And yet it is nowhere to be found. So the point, therefore, I think that if people are given a chance to articulate not only rights but entitlements, claims, duties, obligations, why not? I mean, again, the idea that you can have rights without obligations is ridiculous. Liberals say, no, because if you condition rights to obligation, then you will not be entitled to the right unless you fulfill the obligations. But that is the nature of life. But you want to create an illusionary world in which you can have rights without obligations? Who is going to fulfill the rights if nobody has the obligations? So therefore, I think we don't need to sort of throw overboard the liberal way of thinking. Liberals are entitled to that and be happy with it, fine, that's not a problem for me. But I need to have alternatives way of thinking about these issues.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent extension and deserved that time. But if we have that length of time, we'll only have time for 2 more questions. So may I encourage you to try and be brief so that we can
me
hear
too,
more
of course,
voices,
yeah.
if possible.
Yeah, I didn't get carried away.
I enjoyed that. Try that. I'm going to start. I'm going to take 3 if I may.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Faiza. I'm coming from Iraq, and I actually come from Pakistan. Thanks for putting emphasis on the communities, but the violators often come from communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we end up?
Okay.
Mine was actually a comment more than a question, so we can. Quick. The quickest one is that because I'm coming from Ukraine, and obviously the 70 years of Soviet Union is a very harsh legacy, and I just wanted to make this comment that the basic economic rights were actually guaranteed, which did not guarantee the freedom itself. So, I mean, housing and healthcare, it doesn't mean that you actually get the rights and freedoms. And I'm just telling this to make sure that we are not missing out on this part of the world, because basically it was like 1/6 of the land.
Okay.
Of the world.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm interested in the process of, do you have a suggestion for a process through which the rights can gain the legitimacy that you're talking about? So through what process can everybody participate?
If I may start with the last one, because we have had some 14,000 years of human history, right? I listened to these books on tape and so on, and I think that brilliant book about guns, germs, and 14,000, 50,000. We have now over the last 200-300 years, or 14,000 years, we had this notion about rights in this sense and how do we persuade people and so on. My point is to say that communities have lived and created the ability to govern themselves, to promote values, to achieve transformation and social justice entirely out of that framework. And again, when I sense, I don't mean to be, I tend to be, I speak rather strongly. I hope people are not offended by this, because I feel strongly about what I'm saying. The idea of how do you do this, how do you make that happen, already takes away the agency of the subject and makes me the guardian of that subject. So how do I ensure? Who am I to ensure? So therefore I'm saying let people live their lives and create the change they want to change or not. And it is, if I persuade them, I come from a community, I am from northern Sudan, I lived sort of all 40 years of my life in Sudan, and I've seen all of this, and I've tried to do what I can to transform attitudes in that way. But so I'm saying that it is human ingenuity and human dignity as well is not lost by inability to be persuasive about this. On the question about my friend here about housing and healthcare, of course, I did not mean to say that these are exclusive or these are the only key, but I said that people would have these priorities. But of course, they may also have other priorities. But the idea of saying that these are economic and social rights and these are civil and political rights, that's a liberal idea. Came out of the liberal sort of by the way, the Soviet Union was a Western civilization and society. It's not something different.
Nobody would agree with you in Russia, I can tell you.
But that is precisely the point, that I have the right to say this, although nobody will agree with me. Yes, to me, the Soviet Union and the United States are two sides of the same coin. Have never been otherwise. And now Russia and the United States are two sides of the same coin. They are both neo-colonial powers.
In these terms, for sure.
So, but in any case, my point is to say that let people make their choices. Education, yes. Health, yes. This and that, all they do. But it is not to say that exclusively this or the other. Finally, I come to I am trying, I hope to be brief, the question about violations. Community are source of violations. Yes, of course. But that is the nature of human relationships, that and legal remedies will not redress community violation of rights. Because like often I hear this about the notion that sort of what are you going to do? My approach of transforming attitudes in the community, of galvanizing and mobilizing political will to change in the community, is the only way to protect against community abuse. And the community, by the way, is not an entity either. We tend to talk about community this, community that, as if community is an entity that can do anything. Again, it is just like the international community. It doesn't have an address, it doesn't live anywhere, you cannot talk to it. Community is the community of members of that community. By addressing their attitudes and their action, you are addressing the outcome of those actions. So to the extent that the community is not collectively acting to violate this or the other, it is people who act in that way. And there are people who act in the other way. And you can always persuade people and change, but otherwise, if you think of situations that we are familiar with, most of us in this room probably, but most people around the world, I mean, there is no legal remedy for that. Where would you go to sue the community for what? Where would you go? I mean, is there a court? Is there a way of enforcing that judgment? How do you go home at the end of the day when you sue your community in that manner? It doesn't. That's not the way people think. Now, again, I go back to the idea of how human societies historically have struggled and found ways to defend rights and justice and so on, before we have this so-called liberal notions of rights and justiciability of rights.
I have Chip. Are there any more hands? Because it's maybe the last round. Oh, I have two.
Okay. I love and respect you so much, I can't let your plea for an urgent plea for rebuttal go unanswered, so I'm going to give you a 30-second quick one. And I think I know why you haven't accepted it, because you very well know where it is. But your criticisms are very valid in terms of giving us another counterpoint. But as you well know, UDHR included ESCR rights, the ones you said most people and yourself would probably prioritize: health, food, clothing, shelter, that sort of thing. And I would say the system that we've got is working better. Moreover, in other words, there has been increasing recapture of those rights since the Cold War ended, and there are more optional protocols, there are more, including judicial resolutions. There's a lot, many hundreds of cases and committee reports where practical action on the ground is being transformed. Policy is changing around the world to better realize the dignity. Now, communities, yes, they're fiction, so is the International Committee, so are corporations, but so are states, and so they're change agents within states. Yes, states pursue realpolitik, but they're individual people, and you've met them and I've met them, and there's some here, they're representatives of states that are positive change agents that are actually making progress. So my question is, given the reality that this is the system we've got, and it's doing some good, and we're probably not going to have the process where we ask everybody in the world what their rights are, unless we have some new technology that allows that. Between now and then, that utopia, do you not agree that we should work within the system? Yes, critiquing it. Yes, calling attention to its deficiencies. Calling the question, especially where it's helping the privileged and not the people who need the help. But would you recognize we need to really work with the system we've got and constantly improve it in that way?
Who is the we?
The we being all of us as individuals and the people that we're. I agree with you that it's ultimately culture and values.
No, not only cultural values, it's power.
Yes, but they get, Frederick Douglass says power doesn't respond unless there's a demand. But it's precisely those demands that have gotten the progress we've had, like, the progress on non-discrimination laws, practices at the state implementation.
I understand and accept, but I'm asking who is the we, because I know that the we is far, far, far from the universal human being that we claim to be, whose rights and dignity we claim to be concerned about.
Sometimes the victim might say, at least let me use the system that is around me, even though it is really broken and ineffective and not adequate. So
absolutely, the victim will say that. And I, as a victim myself, have said that. But how about the rest of us who are not victims at the time being? Before we become victims, what do we do? And how do we make sure that, why should one be in a position where they have to accept because they are victims? The point is that why did we have to, coming to ideology and coming to the question of priorities, and why liberalism is relativist and has been the driving force of the formation of international human rights law. Why do we have two covenants? And as you and I know, and many of these people know in this room, there are very different language, very different expectations, very different mechanisms. Why do we have optional protocols? What happens after all of that? Why did the European Convention not include a single civil and political right, economic and social rights? Not a single economic and social rights. A whole convention, the most successful regional system, does not include a single economic and social rights. When Europe came around in the 1980s and 90s to acknowledge, it came through charters. Why charters? Why not legally binding treaties? Why not having it equally enforceable by the European Court of Human Rights? So the point is that, and it is absolutely to be expected, that every society, every institution will reflect the values, the priorities, the ideology of its members. Absolutely, by all means. But if we're talking about the membership of 6 billion human beings around the world, not 7 or 100 million in Europe, then we should talk about what appeals to all of them together. So I take your remarks and accept the point that because I'm seeking challenge and rebuttal, and I hope that I will be able to better represent the point I'm making. But I think that we cannot deny that the very idea of that compartmentalizing human life into sort of segments of freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and have a notion of collective, dynamic, organic understanding of when I said to you about the elderly. What is the response? So if there's a rebuttal, let me give you a counter rebuttal.
I have three voices.
Okay.
And I'm sure the rebuttals and counter rebuttals will definitely continue.
Continue,
in the next,
yes, yeah.
2 weeks that you're here at least.
Yeah, my question is on communities. I agree, and I truly believe that communities and change can only happen if the community prioritize, accept the issue, and then go ahead to respect their own beliefs. But I also wonder whether this, if we let it, again, I don't know who we is, but if it's left to the community, then doesn't that also reflect evolution, survival of the fittest?
Okay.
So does that mean for human rights to have to get dark before we see human rights? If we leave it, again, to who we is, but if it's left to the community to decide what is important.
Okay.
Okay, and Penny?
It's a little related. Thank you very much. That was very useful, provocative, but very good. I'm just wanting to identify if the we, people who are currently sitting in a Western liberal democracy, if the we is thought of as people, as Western communities or liberalism, do you have any suggestions as to what the attitudes that need to be transformed in Western liberalism are to promote human rights both domestically with respect to refugees or whatever, or in the West's attitudes to
Thank you. And one more, sorry.
One more, okay.
I agree with many of the things. For example, the right to diversity, or the problems that you described. That is very true. I think, in ways I also recognize. But then, living in Germany also with me, and then I somehow thought, I hope it's not, but I felt like maybe you are also kind of, your personality and thinking is created because you're in the United States, and some of the things that you described, for example, the refugees are not humans, for example, that maybe apply in the region, but not everywhere. I have that feeling. And I was very curious, aside from the human rights work or legal work that you did, maybe the experience that made you think in that way, the things that brought to you when you were outside of the country.
Okay. That's precisely my point. If you think about what you just said, is what I have been saying, is that each of us are shaped by our experiences, by our lives, our culture, our context, our class, and so on. So yes, so if, and to the extent that living in the United States the last 20 years of my life, having lived 40 years in Sudan before that, have shaped my thinking more than it would have otherwise been, that makes my point even stronger, meaning that people are shaped by who they are, where they are. That's why none of us can claim to speak for the universal. Every single one of us is relative to who he is, where she lived, and so on and so forth. So your life in Germany shaped your thinking and way of outlook and approach, which is fine. But it cannot be claimed to be universal of all human beings, because that was your experience in Germany. And I wouldn't think that it is true in Germany or anywhere that refugees receive the full human rights treatment that they are entitled to by virtue of their humanity. It may vary, I'm sure, where places where refugees are chased out or walls are built to keep them out, versus places where they are kept in camps and processed over time. But I think if you think of the full range of human rights are due to the human, in any case, we may agree or disagree about that, but the point I'm making is that who we are, where we are, influences and shapes our thinking. If I may come to the point about what's it called? Community. I'm sorry. Is that? Yes. The thing is that how to make change in communities, and how to achieve the transformation that we need. whoever claims to be an advocate of any human right, that is what she should do. Meaning that you should not form a human rights organization that seeks funding in order to write reports, in order to send them to Geneva. That is not going to do anything. Zero. The achievement of international protection of human rights at the level of the people that we are talking about is zero. But in those communities, the people who seek to make the change, go for it. Don't wait for someone. That is the when at some point I entered the point about what I call colonial ability. That the colonialism may have left our homes, but it remains in our hearts and minds. We are still looking to the colonial, and even the post-colonial, I say, is defined by the colonial too. Epistemologically, conceptually, materially, in every way. Until that stops, and we focus on what we have and what we can do with it, we are dependent. And that dependency will diminish our humanity. If I may remember your last point about what to do in liberal democracies to change attitudes, is that what you are saying? I think that, of course, I mean, I wish I'm really part of that sort of environment in which I don't really feel belonging to these Western liberal democracies where I happen to be living the remaining years of my life in this environment, but it is not something that I passionately relate to. I am passionate, and I'm passionate about many things, but it doesn't happen to be this. Now, let us be honest, and let us be very candid. Talk about this country as a liberal democratic country, and what can I do to improve human rights. Remember the history of this country? Remember the atrocities that this country committed? Speaking in Oxford, remember the people who came out of the halls of this university and ruled in places like Sudan, where in 5 hours, British forces killed 10,000 Sudanese. Think of Syria and Iraq, think of Lebanon and Jordan, think of this whole region that is now up in flames. Who is responsible for having planted the seeds of the current carnage and destruction of life and property that we see in Syria and Iraq? Who made Syria in such an arbitrary fashion, an irresponsible, unaccountable fashion? So I happen to have a long memory. I don't forget easily. So I would rather wait for people to change themselves in a way that shows that they are capable of moral leadership before I concede that moral leadership to them.
I think, Professor Ahmed, you have guaranteed areas, I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but I think you've guaranteed areas that we agree with you and also areas we disagree with you. And I think those disagreements will also be the fruit of many debates, as some of you go and dress formally and others go for a barbecue. But may we all take the opportunity first to honor Carlos and Ahmed for living the life that they were committed to and coherently lived it and gave their lives to it. And thank you to you for making us think so much about these topics in, the very framework and foundations of it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.